as the shingle style, published in 1955, rethought American domestic architecture of the late 19th century and showed how it paved the way for modern architecture. The Earth, the Temple, and the Gods, published in 1962, looked at classical architecture in a way that was altogether different from the way classicists had treated it. Scully saw Greek temples not as an ordered system of architectural form, but as the assertion of the gods, as represented by man's creation into and onto the form of the earth. Man was heroic, positioning himself on the earth as a challenge to nature as much as an embrace of it. It is no accident that Scully's book, Modern Architecture, published in 1960, looked at modern Western architecture in the same kind of heroic terms. The community of scholars of classical architecture did not think much of Scully's approach, and by and large dismissed his connection between architecture and landscape. He was shaken and quite saddened by the mixed critical response to the Earth, the Temple, and the Gods. Scully may have celebrated heroism, but he did not have himself the hero's indifference to popular response. Not, I think, because of this criticism, but more because of what I earlier called his exquisite sensitivity to what was going on in the world, not that many years after The Earth, the Temple, and the Gods was published. Scully began to see things differently. The 60s changed him, as they changed so many people. He was active in protesting against the Vietnam War. He marched on the New Haven Green in 1968, living the intention of the city's planners that the central square be a meaningful public realm. He became highly active as a critic of New Haven's celebrated urban renewal program under Mayor Richard C. Lee. Scully saw earlier than many critics how much of it depended on eviscerating the city's poorer neighborhoods, replacing low-income quarters, however stable they may have been, with highways and fancy buildings by famous architects. Urban renewal, Scully wrote, was cataclysmic, automotive, and suburban, a beautifully considered trio of words. Scully had come to think that the heroism he had once admired, the American and modern heroism that he considered the heir to the Greek heroism that brought civilization, the Greek temples, was a sham, a sign of arrogance more than greatness. The Vietnam War and urban renewal were both, Scully felt, American arrogance run amok. He became so disenchanted with a certain kind of architectural ambition that he once referred to the architecture of Kevin Roche as paramilitary dandyism. He became a strong advocate of historic preservation and publicly apologized for not being sufficiently enlightened about preservation back in 1963 to have joined the protest against the demolition of Pennsylvania Station in New York. He made up for that with what is probably the most famous line ever uttered about the glorified subway station that is the current Pennsylvania Station. Once, Scully said, one entered the city like a god. Now you scuttle in underground like a rat. By 1974, Scully had published a new edition of Modern Architecture with an added chapter subtitled The Age of Irony, which supplemented quotes from Camus with quotations from Shelley and Wallace Stevens. Students in his lecture courses in the 1960s and 1970s, of whom I was one, recall Scully telling them with a candor they did not expect to find from an eminent professor, how he'd changed his mind about many of the things that he had most believed early in his career, most particularly the notion that modern architects could boldly remake the world. He was always enough of an urbanist to have viewed the ville radieuse with skepticism, if not outright disdain, but he came to view Le Corbusier's buildings increasingly in terms of how well they worked into an urban fabric, rather than in terms of their sculptural power. He placed on his lecture screen an image of Le Corbusier's High Court at Chandigarh when it was new, and then a later one showing its pillars painted in bold colors. In an earlier time, Scully might have suggested that the paint was a defacement, but by the 1970s, he proclaimed his willingness to see it more as an attempt to humanize the buildings. The evolution in Scully's thinking is in many ways expressed by the contrast between the earth, the temple, and the gods, and one of the books that followed it, Pueblo, Mountain Village Dance, published in 1975. Both books share a view of architecture not as pure form, but as object inseparable from the landscape. The difference was that Greek temples, for Scully, boldly confronted the earth. Pueblos, by contrast, accommodated to it. The temple was assertive and freestanding, the Pueblo, gentle and connected. If classical scholars had not been enthusiastic about Scully's new way of seeing the Greek temple, and it was indeed a new way, when he turned his attention to the American Southwest, he was able both to enter territory little explored by previous architecture historians, and also to find a parallel to his wish to turn modern architecture away from heroism and toward accommodation. It's important to say one more word about the book that came in between The Earth, the Temple, and the Gods and Pueblo, Mountain Village Dance, and that is American Architecture and Urbanism of 1969. It is in many ways the work most characteristic of Scully's impassioned and socially engaged approach to architectural history. It was surely the one that most closely replicated the famous experience of the Yale lectures with their cavalcade of images, rapid-fire associations, and comparisons between architecture and painting, architecture and poetry, and works of high and vernacular architecture. As I've said, Scully was deeply engaged by the urban crisis of the 1960s, and he wanted to use the tools of the architectural historian to offer a sweeping vision of the United States as a nation whose love of movement and open space had left it in deep conflict about its cities. Scully wrote in another of his characteristic phrases, "At once a call to action and a reverie. We can hardly flee our neighbors along the high road forever. Crazy the image and dear to us, and if we are fortunate, we shall make more of it in the future, farther out and wilder. But it cannot be all. Its pursuit is of emptiness, and we must stand up now to urban life with our fellows in our feared and hated cities, though the smell of the morning break the heart on the high plains."